Hi guys, I'm Mike and this is F1 Fanatics. Welcome back to another F1 Worldwide, the fan podcast, and we have another very special guest with us here today. I think it's kind of been a collaboration a long time coming, but surprisingly enough, we've both got a bit more time on our hands during this Corona break. So Dan, welcome onto the channel.
Hey Mike, thanks for having me, dude. I think we've got a very tasty topic coming up today, and I'm really looking forward to it.
No problem at all. And if for some reason you have come across our channel before Dan from F1E Reviews, obviously, please do go and check him out and subscribe it. And from the topic today, if you haven't guessed by the thumbnail, that I presume you've looked at and then decided to click on as we go through this, we are going to be talking about Romain Grosjean today and the enigma that is Romain Grosjean. I don't think Dan hides the fact that he's a little bit of a fan of Romain, but I'm sure, you know, we both, there's balance to the argument either side, but we're just going to have quite a nice relaxed chat about Romain because he is an enigma to me in terms of, because he's a guy with incredible pace. He's a very talented driver, but the career hasn't maybe necessarily panned out as he would have thought, and some reputations some may argue unfairly kind of attached to his name. It has kind of defined him. So I think he started off his day. He's a French driver. It's no surprise he started off his days with Renault. So do you want to talk about us a little bit at the start of Romain's career, Dan?
Well, I'll start off by saying I don't think Romain Grosjean's everyone's cup of tea, which pains me a little bit, but I'm not a fanboy, just passionate, in the words of Matt Gallagher. But all the way back in 2009, I remember when Grosjean came in. I think it was the Valencia, the European Grand Prix, and it was way into the season, about round 15, replacing Piquet Jr. And he's a driver who had done well in junior categories. He'd won GP2 Asia, but yet to really assert himself in the standard GP2 that we know here in the UK. But that 2009 season wasn't great, and arguably it was his worst ever in Formula 1, and I'm sure we'll talk about 2018 a little bit later on, but I think 2009 was a little bit worse, and it's understandable. He'd only, like I say, done a couple of junior series and was certainly not ready, I would argue, to jump into Formula 1. But thanks to Spygate, Renault didn't really have much of a choice. They had paid a hell of a lot of money to sort out the whole Spygate situation, getting rid of Piquet and the fines involved with that. That Grosjean, who was their reserve driver, was almost the default option. And though he wasn't ready, he was alright. He wasn't crashing out every weekend, but he didn't score a single point in those 6 or 7 races in 2009. So it's understandable why they decided to drop him for 2010. Though I believe, listening to his Beyond the Grid podcast, they had originally planned to keep him for 2010. But from a Grosjean fan perspective, I'm glad he went back to GP2 and had a couple of years out to continue his development.
Yeah, it did really feel like a time too soon, and I think it almost hindered his development a little bit. That still kind of came back what you'll see in 2012 in terms of it just felt a bit rushed, and then it raises expectations because now you've driven in F1. Because yeah, he didn't score a single point, but it's hardly a nice spot to be thrown into. I mean, you know, most people would bite your hand off for kind of an opportunity to race in Formula 1. It doesn't matter what the circumstances come. But for a young rookie who, you know, still, hadn't won the GP2 series at that stage, it was a big step with no practice, no kind of pre-season to get used to the team. Yes, obviously he was the test driver, but he certainly at the start of the season wouldn't have been having any time in a car and the thought that, oh, I'm actually going to be racing this year for Renault.
And up against Alonso as well. I mean, of all the teammates to go up against, Fernando definitely would not be the kind of person you want to be going up against in your first season. Like you just said, Mike, as a driver, to have not had hardly any experience jumping into a car under that amount of pressure And Renault back in 2009 weren't a team winning every weekend. I mean, they're still not today, but it wasn't the limelight being thrust into a top three team, but they were still a respectable team and a team expected to fight for the points. And I certainly think, I think you've kind of alluded to it there, even though anyone's going to jump at a chance of going into Formula One, I think it definitely did him a hell of a lot of good just having those couple of years out, then returning in 2012. And going back to GP2, winning the title so convincingly at the end of 2011 is kind of the driver that I still think is in there in modern Formula One. And on his day, he kind of showed specks of this in 2009. When he gets it right, he really gets it right. It's just there are issues that he had in 2009 and still prevalent today where he's definitely a driver that runs on his emotions, I would definitely say. And I'm sure that's a theme that will come up a little bit later on in today's video as well.
Certainly will do. And obviously, we've alluded to there, he had a break. So 2009, he took part in that kind of tail end of the season. Then he left for a couple of years, winning the GP2 title in 2011. And then we look at the kind of Lotus Renault days. And although they are mixed, some through, fault of his own and some through like 2014 when it was just an absolute dog of a car. But there were some very massive highs in this season as well, and 2012 was a real mix for me because I think he scored 3 podiums within that year with 2 third place finishes, which I'm pretty sure were a double podium for Lotus in that season as well as a second place finish in the race, but also then marred with the Spa incident, which for me is something that unfortunately has marred his career. I don't think people have ever forgiven him for it, which is a little bit unfair.
Yeah, it's a tricky one because, like you say, 3 podiums in what is his first rookie season in Formula One. Any other driver, you'd say, you know what, that's a really respectable year. And it was the first proper season where Lotus fully came on board. They were kind of 50-50 in 2011, but 2012, alongside Raikkonen, I think he fared quite well actually. And I think the driver that we saw in 2009 was certainly not the more complete driver we saw in 2012. I think it was only 4 races into the season where he scored his first podium in Bahrain. He scored points in the 3rd race in China. So you can definitely look at some of the statistics from 2012 and think, yeah, Grosjean had a really strong first season. But like you've mentioned there were several incidents in his first race back in Australia. Made contact early on in the Grand Prix and retired. Likewise in Malaysia for round 2. And very quickly, for a driver to be in their first season of F1, to get to the halfway stage in Spa, and then after that for Monza get a race ban, that is almost unheard of. And considering that happened and he's still in F1 today, kind of baffles me a little bit, even though I'm a big fan of Romain. Because most teams would have let him go, I would say, for 2013. Even though, like I say, he got those podiums and that drive in Canada where he got 2nd place was an awesome drive from him and there was ability there. It's not very often that drivers get second chances in Formula One. And the fact that Lotus gave him the opportunity to come back stronger in 2013. First of all, I'm very thankful of as a Grosjean fan. But I'm glad that they gave him that confidence and belief. And I've often found throughout Romain's career, when he's given the opportunity and when he kind of has that shoulder to cry on a little bit, when he knows the team trusts in him, his performances elevate to a next level. And when he came back in 2013, mistakes that were often happening in 2012, first lap incidents, I can't quite remember the quote Mark Webber gave at the beginning of the Japanese Grand Prix in 2012 when Grosjean took him out. It was a crazy lunatic. I was like, there's something along those lines. The year later when they went to Japan, Grosjean had a brilliant opportunity to win that race. It was only Vettel in the Red Bull that was able to get the better of him. And to just over a year see the development of that driver is again kind of unheard of. And I think the title, The Enigma of Romain Grosjean, kind of just spans throughout his entire career. Because again, 2012, a race ban being replaced by D'Ambrosio, and perhaps he was lucky it was D'Ambrosio because he wasn't the best, bless him, in that one race in Monza. But I think he did well enough against Raikkonen. Those 3 podiums, which turned into 6 the following season, I think he really turned himself around in 2013.
Absolutely, and this is it. It might be harsh to say. It might be the pinnacle of his career. 2013, 2015 was very strong considering the circumstances in that last year of Lotus, but I think that's a very interesting point you make about the development that he showed from 2012 to 2013, and I think he showed enough in 2012 because remember, after getting that second place in Canada, actually in the European Grand Prix, he was running in second place in that race as well. To Fernando Alonso before he had an alternator issue like Sebastian Vettel did in that race. And, if that would have been back-to-back second place finishes, that would have been pretty immense considering, rookie season. I mean, I know he finished 8th in the championship and Kimi Raikkonen finished 3rd, but you're talking about comparing a guy to who, although Kimi Raikkonen had 2 years out of the sport, was once perceived as one of the top talents to overtake from Michael Schumacher and a world champion himself. It's not a bad effort in your rookie season. Plus, with that race ban, that he had to find him. I sound like a broken record probably in recent videos because it's a line that I just think is a really nice line that sums it up. That DC in the kind of 2012 season review described Roman as a quick driver, but not a good driver. And it seems like one of those throwaway lines that are a bit cliche to kind of get a quote. But there is a difference between the two. And I think Roman, throughout his career, has struggled to find the consistency that would put him into that good driver category. But I don't think there's ever really been a doubt throughout his entire career of the pace he had. And 2013 was certainly a season where he showed it off, and getting 7th in the championship in the Lotus was pretty impressive.
Yeah, and I think just to add on that as well, I definitely agree with the statement. He's a quick driver. I'd like to say he's a good driver, but I definitely understand what you mean by that. And even over the past couple of years, I'll go back to 2013 in a second, but past couple of years in qualifying, he's done really well up against Kevin Magnussen. But as another famous saying is, you don't get points on Saturday, and it's certainly often that in those opening few laps, for whatever reason, his racecraft just isn't quite to the standard of other drivers. But certainly, I said it just at the beginning as well, I feel he's an emotional driver because at the end of 2013, he was one of the, again, this might be slightly biased, but when you go back and watch a season review or watch it on F1 TV or whatever, from I think it was after Singapore, he retired from the Singapore Grand Prix. But for the end of that season, he got 4 podiums in the remaining 6 races, and certainly he's a driver I feel that relies on form more than any other. And he's someone, like you say, who's very quick. And when he's in the right mindset, when he's got a big result, like he got a podium in Korea, I think it was, then 2 more in Japan and India, then had that incredible second place in the USA. It's moments like that and flurries like that where you start to think, oh, hold on, maybe he's lost this way of making these silly little incidents, these, I was going to say silly racecraft, but maybe that's a little bit harsh. But like you say, he's definitely someone who made the most, I think, of 2013. Whereas 2012, probably the best car of his career. He didn't make the most of it, but that was his rookie season. He learned. And for 2014 and 15, really was thrown in at the deep end to a highly historical team in Formula One, a team that had won championships, had drivers like Mansell, like Senna, like Jim Clark, all the way back in the 60s. And he was now only in his 3rd year of Formula One and was the team leader alongside Maldonado. Now, I think for a lot of people that are just getting into Formula One, imagine that would have been chaos. Grosjean and Maldonado. But I think really quickly over those couple of years, it was another steep learning curve. But definitely I think he adapted to that role really well. And I often think, I think there's certainly a reputation with Grosjean that he's a bit of a crash master, loves to find himself in the barriers. But from 2014 pretty much up to 2018, he really cleaned up his act. And for a time, before he moved to Haas, was one of the more sought-after drivers in the driver market. And that loyalty to Lotus that Lotus had shown him at the end of 2012 really paid off. And moving a little bit further on, and I'm sure we might go back in a second, but culminating in that podium in Spa, I think Grosjean really did make the most of that opportunity at Lotus.
Definitely, I agree. I think he's one of those unfortunate, and it's something that we've had time without races, so you kind of start going in your head and overthinking things over and over and just going. And even more so, I kind of look now back at careers of certain drivers and go, those are seasons that kind of changed it. And just think, the end of that 2013 season, he's gathered all that momentum. And, that second place in the USA, unfortunately retired in the Brazil race. But, the 2014 was such a poor car in comparison to the 2013. And although his reputation, was still good, it kind of halted his momentum as a driver. And, that the 2013, he hasn't finished higher in the championship since then. And you could argue he hasn't had a car capable of finishing in the championship since then. But I think it did allow him to become a team leader. And I think his development of the car, which are skills that even today that Haas, I think, find invaluable. And well, I think it's one of the main reasons, we'll probably talk about it when we get onto Haas, is why he retained that seat for the 2020 season when it finally kind of kicks off. But yeah, that 2015 season, the car got better, obviously going to that Mercedes power unit, because we all know in 2014, if you didn't have a Mercedes power unit, you might as well not have turned up for the season. And so they got that power unit, and well, that Spa performance, you were actually at that race, weren't you? So on a personal level, I guess that one is a very special podium, and his last podium to date in F1. It may turn out to be his last podium, but you never know in these things in Formula One. But yeah, it was a pretty special performance.
Yeah, I mean, like you say, that's good knowledge from you. You've done your homework, Mike. Yeah, that was the first ever race I went to, and I was 15 years old back in 2015, but I was aware that Lotus had struggled in 2014, and when they showed up to Spa that year, I think Grosjean had only scored maybe 4 or 5 points finishes. Maldonado seemed to retire from every Grand Prix, and they showed up to that weekend after the summer break with the bailiffs there. And what a difficult time that must have been for Grosjean, for Maldonado, for everyone at Enstone, and qualified really well that weekend. He was 4th on the grid, and I remember thinking, crikey, he's never going to be able to stay there on the grid. He had a grid penalty as well, so started outside the top 10. But the race itself, for whatever reason that weekend, Grosjean and Lotus were so entwined. They had the setup perfect, the race was sublime, and yes, they were helped out by Vettel's tyre exploding a few laps from the end, but certainly it stands out. And again, this might be slightly biased because I was there, but for me stands out as his best race of his career. I mean, 2015 was a season where, just like today, we had Red Bull, Ferrari and Mercedes with the top 3. Then you had your midfield and best of the rest. And Lotus certainly weren't the best of the rest. But again, he still made the best of that situation. And I think he finished just outside the top 10 in that season. And Renault, who bought the team out, that was the first weekend where we found out the team were going to evolve to Renault to 2016, actually gave him a contract, but he decided to move on after that season and move to Haas, which I also find quite interesting, and I wonder what his thought process was at the time. But certainly, whereas at the end of 2013, I think people had a lot more respect for Grosjean, I think that weekend in Spa gave people a hell of a lot more respect for Grosjean, and I think maybe some people forgave him for what happened in 2012, and I think this was the first opportunity where people could see, and the fact it was at the same circuit as well at Spa was quite nice and unique. But I think people could see that Grosjean had grown up and was slowly starting to become a team leader and someone who could really help a team like Haas move its way up the grid.
Yeah, Spa Redemption's probably a good one to title it if it was like a film we're trying to go on. And I think I remember reading that he actually cried during the last lap of that Spa race
So did I.
because we know, we've mentioned it several times, he's an emotional guy, and we'll probably talk about him as a character. But for me, he's one of the nicest blokes in the grid, and he seems a very nice family man. His family is so important to him. He just seems very well mannered in interviews. Yes, he can be whiny on team radios, but for me, never listen to team radios and make any judgment on a person, because they're all whiny little twits on that place, because they're ultra competitive guys and they want to win. And so if things aren't quite going right, they're going to whinge because they want to win. And it's a team radio which most of the time they don't expect to be publicised, but we all know kind of publicised team radio messages can act on your career rather poorly. Fernando Alonso. But yeah, so he obviously 2015 it ends and he decides to move, which you alluded to it there in terms of it. It's kind of confusing. A team that was, on the cusp of maybe, being removed, the bailiffs there, on the cusp of just kind of completely folding. But Renault were coming back as a full-time entry into the sport in 2016. And he decided to move to brand new team, Haas F1. And moving to a brand new team in F1, considering how hard it is to be successful, it was a very bold career move.
Yeah, and I think at the time, being a Grosjean fan, even I found it quite confusing. I thought he would stay at Enstone. Renault is where he made his Formula One debut in 2009. He's a French driver, and I feel it lined up quite nicely. But then I think about it now, and I think what an opportunity he had to go to Haas, a team that have ties in NASCAR. And I often think that a driver, it's not a big opportunity, but certainly Haas is going to open doors in American racing if whatever driver decides to retire. But Haas were the first American team in Formula One since BAR. Are they technically an American team? But a brand new team starting from the ground up. No commercial ties. It's a real unique opportunity in Formula One. It's not often we see these, I like to call them proper racing teams, that usually they've got either a marketing focus behind them, like Red Bull, or a commercial side, like your Mercedes, your Ferraris, your Renaults. So a team like Haas doesn't come around very often in Formula One. So it's a unique opportunity, and I can understand why Grosjean went for it. Up alongside Gutierrez, he was definitely going to be the number one. And I definitely think, though he had to come back in 2012 and prove himself, though after 2009, again, he had to prove himself to get back into Formula One, I think that gamble to go to Haas, I would say it's paid off. I don't think he'd still be in Formula One today if he hadn't taken that gamble. But it certainly was the biggest risk of his career, I would say, and biggest challenge as well, moving to a team that have never done a race before. Yeah, I'm not too sure I would have been that brave.
Yeah, it is a big career move, and sometimes, at time of recording this, there is someone who's made a very big career move in Carlos Sainz to Ferrari. And you have to admire these people who take on a challenge, because, different circumstances with Sainz one, in terms of he's going into one of the biggest team names in Formula One history against a guy who seems to have got the team under his belt. But Grosjean, he's got this new project. You don't know if it was unsuccessful in that first season. The plug might be pulled. I mean, rumours now today, you could say Gene Haas, is he running out of patience with the project to be competitive? It's on the line a little bit there. But it was an incredibly bold career move, and finishing 6th in Australia in their first race it's not a bad return. And then 5th the race after. It must have felt pretty good at that stage, and he must have felt like, if this does come off, it could be fantastic for me.
Yeah, and looking back at it now, although, in the end of 2015, Renault or Haas, it's, again, I think if he was being safe, he would have gone to Renault. That first year at Haas, my goodness, did he look so good. And no offence to Gutierrez fans out there, if they still exist, I suppose, but Gutierrez was kind of made to look like a rookie. He'd only done, was it one season before? So he's only in his second season of Formula One, I believe. It might have been third. Anyway, he didn't have as much experience as Grosjean, but Grosjean clearly took the opportunity by the neck and established himself at the number one. And I still think his work in 2016, where he finished 13th overall, but for a brand new team, that is incredible. Actually, was it 13th overall? Yeah, yeah.
It was
That's an
13th. Yeah.
incredible achievement in the team's first season. And then the year after, again finishing 13, only one less point that season. Another really strong season. And that was up against Magnussen. And already you're starting to think, well, Grosjean, he's done really well at Lotus. At Haas, he's now really proving himself. And I think that's why nowadays I get a little bit frustrated when this reputation of a crash master has returned, because before 2018, he was undisputed number one at Haas and looked to be the guy to really propel them forward over the next couple of years.
No, I completely agree. And I think what's more impressive, that 2016 finishing 13th in the championship, is the fact that there were still 3 retirements in that season and 2 races where they didn't start. So that's more impressive. And 13th again in 2017 against, new teammate Kevin Magnussen. Admittedly, he would have had the established team in that front, so it would have been difficult for Kevin Magnussen to do it, who was, bless him, searching for a home in Formula One. Was Kevin. He's never really been given a shot at anywhere other than Haas, which Grosjean, I think they both kind of really made it their home over this period. But yeah, 2017 things were looking up, and I suppose it's so frustrating for Grosjean because of the car that they had in 2018. Obviously they could have finished best of the rest in that season if it had all pieced together, but he unfortunately had that incident in Spain in 2018 where, look, he's made a poor judgment. Is it the worst thing that I've ever seen on a Formula One track? No. by no means. It's an error that he got completely wrong. You can argue that, what would he be at that stage? Would he be 33 or 32 at that stage of making a mistake? And you can argue, should a guy who's been in F1 as long as Grosjean be making a mistake like that? But geez, racing drivers are human beings. They're even the best make mistakes. Look at Sebastian Vettel at Monza last year. That wouldn't kind of tarnish my view on what Sebastian is for his entire career. But heck, did he get that one wrong on that occasion? And yeah, I think especially with Drive to Survive that came out, for me, the reputation for modern fans about Grosjean crashing came back, which I feel is unfair to tarnish his entire career with, because what we've spoken about, that there has been so many positives in his career that's proven his quality and worth to the F1 grid. But I think it showed his mental fragility and the very lonely place it is to be a Formula One racing driver. And he really struggled, I think, with the mental side of things.
Yeah, I think 2018 was definitely a big season for Grosjean. And to touch on Drive to Survive, I certainly think, and I love Drive to Survive, but I think for us fans that have watched Formula One for several years, we're aware that the stories they paint aren't necessarily 100% true. They like to twist little things and over-dramatise it. And I like that about Drive to Survive, but I think for new fans that are jumping into Formula One for the first time that don't necessarily or aren't aware of that, I think Grosjean, especially in that first season of the show, wasn't painted in the best manner. And I concede 2018 was pretty poor from Grosjean, especially in the first half. I mean, I think you're right that they could have finished in the top half, or the top 4, of the constructors' standings. But I certainly think what happened in Australia was a huge factor in the overall finish, because both drivers from 5th and 6th, their tyres fell off and no points. And those points on that particular day could have elevated them up. But again, that was the team's third season in F1. And still now, going into 2020, this is only their fifth year. They're still a very, very young team. And I think what makes Grosjean's case worse and what makes me feel for him even more is when he does mistakes, they're always just extra bizarre, if that makes sense. So we've seen drivers, I don't know, let's think of Valtteri Bottas, let's say, in Mexico last year, crashing in qualifying through the final corner, and you kind of forget about it. It's an incident, you move on. Grosjean in 2018, in Azerbaijan, crashed behind the safety car. That's quite an irregular way to retire from a Grand Prix. Then the next race, Spain, as you mentioned, was one of his this is going to be a bit harsh, but one of his dumbest moments in Formula One. But he's aware of that, and he said several times he's an emotional guy. And for those two races to be back to back, certainly put him on a bit of a negative spiral. But then you move a little bit later on into the season, you move to Austria, where he got that incredible fourth place finish, the team's best ever result. And very quickly after that, for the rest of the season, he out-qualified Kevin Magnussen, he out-raced Kevin Magnussen, but those two big incidents in Baku and Spain, I think when you initially think of Grosjean in 2018, that's what you think of. And those first 8 races where he didn't score at all really hurt him over the course of the season. But from my standpoint, I'm always looking out for Grosjean on the timing table and where he finished. That second half of the year, he definitely went under the radar. A couple of 8th place finishes doesn't necessarily stand out on a particular weekend. But when you look at his results as a whole, I can understand why the team kept him on. And if it was the other way round, say the first start of the season he got all those points, and those last 8 races he made all those mistakes, maybe they wouldn't have kept him on. But I would say those first 8 races were bad, but it was the first real time since 2012 where he really started to make mistakes. Things were starting to spiral out of control, the snowball effect really. But again, like we've said already today, that 4th place in Austria, he's such a man that relies on form. That one result, snap, he's back into it, away we go, and it does well for the rest of the season. And you said that Coulthard quote, he's a quick driver, but not a good driver. I would add to that, he's a quick driver, but an emotional driver. He's someone who needs those big results, and when it's not going right, he gets a little bit more aggressive. He knows what's at stake and makes more mistakes. So 2018, again, I think isn't helped by Drive to Survive, that focused on those negatives, not really any of the positives, which I understand, but I certainly think it wasn't as bad as people say, though I don't think it was good, if that kind of makes sense.
No, it makes complete sense. And look, we're all different human beings, and we need to be managed in a different way. And this is how we'll kind of look at the Haas chapter for me. And it's something that certainly was highlighted in Drive to Survive 2. Obviously, Gunther Steiner became a bit of a hero from the series in season 1 and season 2. But for me, especially in season 2, his manner in the way that he manages people, it may work in some incidents, but it's especially a stark contrast to Toto Wolff. And look, Toto Wolff does have it easier, I'd say, in terms of everything, in terms of it. But Toto has also moulded Mercedes into that highly efficient, happy working team. Gunther in 2019, it was an awful season in terms of reliability, and not the season that, not the car that Grosjean and Magnussen needed after that 2018 season. But I just think how aggressive that Gunther is, and not really you've mentioned it before in this, Grosjean performs well when he almost has that shoulders cry. He has people that believe in him. I don't think he believes that Gunther believes in him. I think, well, the only positive he would say would probably be in 2019 at the Singapore Grand Prix when, before that, he was announced to retain his seat in 2020 when so many people were calling for him to be dropped from the sport in place of a Nico Hülkenberg. And I don't think that has helped Roman in these past couple of years. that relationship with Gunter. I think it's a real something that's overlooked, that the management of a team can play a massive part in how a driver performs. Yes, he has to be responsible for his own actions, and he would probably admit to himself that his levels haven't been as high as what he maybe would have hoped for. But I think the Gunter factor is a massive factor, especially in the last 2 years.
Yeah, and you're right. I think it's definitely something that people overlook. I think it's always a difficult one with Gunther because, again, I think Drive to Survive probably takes, well, they probably just stick a camera to wherever he goes now over the entire course of the season. And from interviews I've seen, they seem to have quite a strong but unique relationship in Formula One because, like you say, Gunther is not someone who's afraid to speak his mind, and I'm sure when Grosjean's had an incident, he's definitely someone that probably makes the situation worse. But then I definitely think he's a manager that when things are going right, like we saw a little bit in Drive to Survive in 2018, when Magnussen was doing so well, he was really great in that situation, being nice and eager. And yeah, I think you're right. He's someone who is going to be controversial. And I wonder whether that could be a reason why they've kept Grosjean, because Grosjean understands how Gunter works. And maybe a driver like Hulkenberg wouldn't necessarily, maybe would misinterpret what Gunter's trying to say potentially. I don't really know. But what I would say about 2019 is a lot of people say it was Grosjean's worst year. And I fully disagree with that. A lot of people say he was the worst on the grid last year. I disagree. The car last year was awful. He got 8 points like he did in 2014, and we've both said how bad 2014 was. And yeah, Kevin Magnussen ended the season on more points. Again in 2019, the tyres did fall off in Australia for Grosjean. There could have been a big chunk of points. Brazil, he was 7th, he was best of the rest. And just before that safety car with Bottas, when everything started to kick off with the Ferraris, he had a ERS failure. And he's certainly a driver last year who had the most retirements, and I feel was unlucky on the reliability side of things. But I just wonder a little bit whether that fire's gone a little bit. 3 points finishes, 8 points. It's like I said, it's okay. Last year was okay, and there were so many difficulties going on with the car being bad, Grosjean using the old chassis, Magnussen using the new one, the whole Rich Energy scenario, which we could be here a long time talking about that nonsense. But there were so many things going on for Haas last year, and I can understand why they've kept him, just for that bit of continuity. And again, it was only their 4th season in F1. But I like your point about Steiner there. I think Steiner...
I think probably picking up on that point that you said, that Steiner's very emotional in terms of that, and obviously Grosjean being very emotional as well. You put both of them together, I imagine it's a very anxiety-driven relationship. Obviously, I'm not going to kind of put on mental health issues or anything like that. I think Grosjean definitely probably struggled with the mental side of things a lot in 2018. But I think if you've got two very erratic, emotional people in their emotions, the manager's got to be stable. And I just think Gunter is too much of on a spectrum of, he can be all over the place, which is fantastic to watch, and he's fantastic to talk to on the pit wall. It's always enjoyable listening to on that front, and he's brilliant for the TV side of things. But maybe in terms of this with the driver relationship, it isn't necessarily perfect. I mean, having situations where Kevin Magnussen's kicking in an office door in terms of the situation, although hilarious for us, it's not selling an ideal situation. But you're right, Grosjean 2019 was not his worst season. Like, the retirements he was getting were stupid in the end. I think there was one that it was like a water pressure issue it might have been the French Grand Prix, and you're just looking at it. And I remember talking about it when we were doing like fantasy, and you're like going, "What? I mean, you could make this stuff up now." The type of stuff that he's retiring with, and the collision at Great Britain, it's the tiniest of touches, and both cars are damaged beyond repair, and it's just beyond belief. And Spain, was a missed opportunity with him and Kevin Magnussen, but teammates are going to fight. They want to do that, and I don't think they did anything too wrong. And one incident that I feel he's always kind of wrongly ridiculed for is the George Russell one at Singapore, because I'm like, he was absolutely slated for that, and that was just because of a reputation. And for me, it was a racing incident. He's tried an overtake, hasn't quite worked. Was it the worst thing in the world? Absolutely not. There'd been Hulkenberg on Sainz earlier on in that race, where he went for a move on the inside that he was never going to make, and put Sainz pretty much out of the race in that one. But they don't get mentioned, and he's tarnished with a bad brush. And I think it just shows on a reputation, and everyone always goes back to 2012, and he's never really been able to shake the race ban, and I'm not entirely sure why. But it just kind of, it was obviously a very bad crash, but it is a surprise for all that he did after those years that people still go back to that instant to blame why he shouldn't be in the sport.
Yeah, and it's funny you've just mentioned Hulkenberg in Singapore there, because I agree with what you've just said. But I think to also add on that, in 2018, we had a similar incident in Spa, like with 2012, caused by Hulkenberg missing his braking point. And the after effects of that, with Alonso going over Leclerc, and that was a big discussion for the Halo at the time. But that incident, at least to the naked eye, looks very similar to 2012, and it obviously it didn't end with a ban for Hulkenberg, and I still love Nico, so I'm not having a go at Nico here. But you're certainly right, Grosjean's one of those drivers, and he's not the first and he's not the last. I mean, Maldonado had it all the time. But he's one of those drivers that any kind of incident he has, even Great Britain, you mentioned it there, people ridicule the two Haas drivers for that incident. It was elevated in Drive to Survive, but people always mention in 2019, the two Haas drivers kept running into each other. Did they really? I mean, Spain, they both made contact. They still ended up in the points. A couple of lost points, but they still ended both in the points. Germany, where they both made contact, the same thing happened. They both ended up in the points. And the only other time Great Britain was the tiniest touch. And again, it's people say, Magnussen's really aggressive. Grosjean always likes to crash. And I get it. Meme culture is a brilliant thing in Formula One. It always gives us a smile and a laugh. And even today, with all the driver transfers that are going on, there's a great bit of light relief going around with some awesome memes. So I'm never going to moan at memes. But definitely, from a fan perspective of Grosjean, it is very frustrating. Because I think that incident in Singapore is a perfect example. I always watch that incident and think, well, Grosjean's left plenty of room. Russell's stayed on the racing line, and it's just one of those incidents. It's a racing incident, but certainly, as you mentioned, it's one that's really highlighted that Grosjean's lost it. He shouldn't be in F1 anymore. And again, I understand it. It's so irregular for a driver to get a race ban. It was the last time a driver has got a race ban, and perhaps if, I don't know, Lance Stroll was close a couple of years ago, and so was Sebastian Vettel. Maybe if those two were able to pick up a ban, I would never wish that on anyone, but maybe that would have given a bit of relief to the pressure that's on Grosjean and that reputation. But I think it's something that he'll never really be able to escape. And a little bit like 2013 through to 2017, he just is a driver that needs clean weekends, and I sadly think it's a little bit too late in his career now to be able to really recover from that.
Yeah, I'd agree on that front. And look, obviously, it was a fight between him and Nico, and I'm pretty sure I remember at the time me talking, if they went Nico, you couldn't really have any complaints about it. But if you went Grosjean, I didn't see why people were ousting him. He's a guy who's been from the team from the start. He's proven he's a guy who's very loyal throughout his career, sticking, with Lotus through it all, and then obviously moving to Haas, and he's been with Haas through the years, and only really 2018, which still wasn't an awful season. It just, some things didn't work out as it planned, and 2019 was, we've already spoken about, the reliability issues were bizarre, and the car just, they couldn't figure it out whatsoever. But one of the main things that come out of that season is Grosjean's technical feedback massively helped them in getting anything from that season. And I know they didn't really score any points in that second half of the season, but they still had some good qualifying performances. Was it I want to say Suzuka that they both qualified in Q3?
I think Grosjean was actually, yeah, I think it was Suzuka. They were both in Q3. Russia, Grosjean was in Q3, and Brazil, Grosjean was in Q3. So qualifying, yeah, they definitely improved. But like you say, the reliability was still so bad. And Brazil, as I mentioned earlier, and he was 7th. He was running well. ERS failure, ended 13th, and just kept on dropping through the field. And the rate of just strange incidents all through the season must have been so frustrating. Japan had an issue on the start. The car wouldn't go and was kept on chugging. And Russia, again, where he qualified in Q3, had a racing incident with Ricciardo and Giovinazzi and ended out of the race on lap 1 in an incident where he was by far the innocent party. Racing incident, but he's just one of those guys that just never seemed to get the luck last season.
No, I think he got sandwiched in the middle, didn't he, in that incident in Russia? Because I remember it well, because I was like, oh, he's had a really great qualifying performance. This is fantastic for him. And then you're like going, the guy can't catch a break. And I think it's how I tend to try and look at most F1 drivers. Look, it's a sport, so there has to be winners and there has to be losers in terms of it. But you always want them to do the best they can, and I always kind of want it. I never want a guy to have a bad season because they've performed badly. You just want them to go, well, actually, there were just guys who were better than them. And Grosjean, I think, is very harshly treated in that 2019 season because for a lot of it, the car didn't really give him the opportunity to fight. But through his career, I think looking back at it, he's coming to an end. It'll be. I don't want to upset you by saying that, Dan, but at 34 now, you go. It's the same when I look at with Nico. They're two guys who had immense talent, and for me, 2012 was obviously the turning point season for Nico Hülkenberg. If he had just managed to even finished on the podium in that Brazil race, I know he was fighting for the win with Hamilton, but it just felt like if he'd got that monkey off his back early on his career, it might have certainly changed a lot of the way that things went and some decisions that may have been made on maybe recruiting or not recruiting Nico in the future. But I think Grosjean's been the same. With that 2012 incident, he recovered from that in 2013, and that 2014 season, it's a shame that he was never able to kind of have a car to build on that momentum and what might have been and what might have people, thought of him after that. But I think he's a guy that you have to look back and go, he has been a success in Formula One, and it's a career of maybe missed opportunities, but to score 10 podiums in F1, quite a lot of drivers in F1 never get one podium, let alone double figures. So, or is it 9? I might have correct.
Yeah, it's 10.
It is 10. I know I am 10 from there. But yeah, it certainly has been an interesting career.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with you. I think it's slowly coming to an end now, and I think again a lot of people will probably argue that he shouldn't have been in F1 over the last couple of years, and I can see where people are coming from. Again, I think he's warranted these last couple of seasons, and from a Haas perspective, you mentioned it earlier, he's really helped them turn around that car last season and slowly progress, and I think Haas could surprise a lot of people in 2020, or at least I hope they will. And I think from what I've seen in different interviews, I think Grosjean's aim was to at least get to 2021, to try those new cars like so many drivers are trying to do. Now they've been pushed back a year. I think it's less and less likely. And whilst I love the guy, he is my favourite. I do think when you've got drivers like Hülkenberg out of Formula One, when you've got drivers like Gasly and Kvyat who are stuck in a Red Bull young driver team that is never really pushing to get to the front of the midfield or even for podiums, I think there's other drivers that realistically now deserve a big opportunity to go to Haas. And I think it would be unfair for them to keep him for several years. If Magnussen decides to move on and there's a space available, then maybe they keep him for that bit of continuity. I'm sure Grosjean's not on the biggest wage, but certainly I think he'll be starting to think now, like so many drivers are doing with everything going on at the moment. Maybe he'll be starting to think, I want to spend a little bit more time at home. Or maybe Haas will be thinking, look, if we want to make the next step, we've done really well in our first few years. If Gene Haas decides, we're going to continue for another 5 years or so, then I think a big refresh, a big revamp, maybe of Steiner, maybe of Magnussen and Grosjean, I think could be a big step forward for the team. But I think you're right. He's someone who, I think his career is underappreciated by a lot of fans. But 10 podiums, at the moment, I'm still going to use a statistic, the same as Charles Leclerc. I'm sure that will change once we get racing in 2020. But he's someone who I think has actually, on the quiet, done very well in his Formula One career.
Yeah, and he certainly hasn't been someone who has outstayed his welcome. I know some would disagree with that, but I think what he still gives to Haas is important for what Haas are as a team, because I think you have to look at certain pictures. If he was like an old driver and the team had a history of promoting youth drivers and holding on, and he'd maybe had the past couple of seasons, you could go, especially with their link with Ferrari, why aren't they giving a place to some of these Ferrari juniors? Why aren't they taking this? Why didn't they have, I think they got offered Charles Leclerc, didn't they? Because he used to be their test driver. Who knows what the story would have been with them if he had been offered the seat. But because Haas have a history of wanting more experienced driving established, it makes sense why they've kept Grosjean on. And for now, it seems like if Magnussen wants to stay, Magnussen for me would be the smart choice to build the team around. And Gasly and Kvyat, they're great options, and they're certainly going to be looked at for midfielders. And I think that's now something that's more important these couple of years, because their career's going nowhere at AlphaTauri. And they're not going to be hanging around in the hope that Max Verstappen leaves Red Bull. Kvyat especially must be looking at it. If he didn't get the opportunity after the first half of the season that he had last year, I think he's gone, well, I'm never going to get it at Red Bull again. So he might as well go to someone and try and create an opportunity like someone like Sergio Perez has done for himself. And you never know what doors might open if Haas want to kind of go that route. But I think he's certainly a guy that's been unfairly treated. Criticism's worthy through his career. He's not a perfect driver, but I don't know any F1 driver who's competed in the sport who's been perfect and not had mistakes. The race ban looms over him, but the podiums are positive. And we'll say it, this is probably the end of the chapter in the next couple of years, and I think he should be someone who's hasn't quite filled the potential that he showed through his career. He could have been something so much more, but he's certainly not had a bad career.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's a nice little note there, because I don't see him staying until 2022. He could show up at the end, or show up even the rest of this season and beat Magnussen, but I just think he's in his mid-30s now. When Raikkonen retires, I think he's going to be the second oldest on the grid, and if Vettel doesn't stay as well, he'll be right up there. But he's someone who has had some really impressive drives, but that potential that we saw in 2011 when he won GP2, in 2012, 2013, even 2015, that Lotus Grosjean that appeared to be there at the beginning of those Haas days just seems to be crumbling away now, which happens to most drivers. And again, I would be the first to be screaming and singing to the hills if he was fantastic and scored podiums in 2020. But I think that's a little bit unrealistic. But I certainly will look back across his entire career with happy memories.
Absolutely, and I think it's important. You're an interesting one, Dan, because there aren't that many Grosjean fans out there. That's not trying to be harsh to Romain, but it's the way it usually folds. If you don't end up in a top team, then you tend to have a kind of struggling on, or less you have like a bit of a cult following. And someone like Nico Hülkenberg has managed to become more popular than Romain Grosjean in their period. And I think, Roman's something that probably achieved more than what Nico did, although Nico, you can argue, maybe had the more potential out of the two that never quite materialised. And I think it's probably, in comparison, a little bit unfair how they're treated. But it's been a great chat, Dan. I've enjoyed this. It's been an interesting F1 Worldwide. It's something a little bit different, kind of talking about a specific driver. I always try to kind of keep a balanced picture on these things. But yeah, it's been enjoyable. I hope you've enjoyed it, Dan.
I have very much enjoyed it. Thanks for having me, Mike. I appreciate doing a Grosjean special. You know that's going to... I'm never going to turn that down. And I hope we can do this again very soon.
Oh yeah, we could potentially do it. I'm sure we'll be working with each other very soon, mate, in terms of another interesting project that we've got on. We'll leave that kind of out there to go from it. But like I said at the start of this podcast, if for some reason you've come across the channel and you're not already a subscriber or supporter to Dan, he does some brilliant content on his channel. In fact, all of it's brilliant. I'd be harsh. Some of it's brilliant, some of it's awful. Too much Grosjean, terrible. But it's certainly he's just like many of us in this F1 YouTube community, an incredibly passionate F1 fan, and just loves sharing it with you lot. And the open lobbies, mailboxes, they're all great things to get involved with. And the F1 Legends that you've started with your mini documentaries, which might be a link to the collaboration that we've got coming up. It is certainly a great one to kind of keep you interested in this Corona break. So go and check Dan out. That's my promotion of you in this podcast, Dan. But yeah, if you're new around here as well, you can subscribe to the channel and obviously keep up to date with all our latest content. As always with this F1 Worldwide podcast, there you go, get the words right. It's out every Saturday, 6 p.m. UK time, where we get members of the F1 community have a chat about an F1 topic, and hopefully you guys enjoy listening it. But for now, you F1 fans, keep racing.